Welcome back to our panel discussion, Leveraging Hybrid Cloud Architectures to Deliver Federal IT, sponsored by NetApp and SAIC here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guest today, Richard McKinney, CIO of the Transportation Department, Kirk Kern, Chief Technology Officer at NetApp USA, Public Sector, and Matt Livingston, Cloud Computing Architect for SAIC. I'm your host, Tom Temin. And let's just talk for a minute about FedRAMP, because that's been kind of the ongoing enabler of cloud in the federal government. Has it, in fact, lived up to the promise, and have you found that it's helped you, Richard, get to cloud providers that you want to over the years that it's been taken to wind up the whole thing?
Well, I mean, FedRAMP's not unlike a lot of things that I've encountered in the federal government. Nothing goes as quickly as you'd like it to. And, I think but I think FedRAMP, on the whole, has been successful in getting a number of cloud service providers through the analysis of their, the security controls and all the things that they have to stand up in order to be able to meet federal requirements. I think it's been successful. Sure, we'd all love for it to take, gone quicker than it has, but I think on the whole it's been very successful.
All right, and Kirk, do you find that agencies actually use it in the way that it was envisioned, which is you don't have to do your own check and your own security audit because of the FedRAMP certification, and operating authority says, yeah, it's there the way an agency has to have it?
Yeah, clearly. Agencies now have a list of 60+ service providers that they can choose from and consume the services with a good level of confidence that they meet all of the NIST SP 800 guidelines. But the topic of this panel, however, is around hybrid computing, and that it opens up an interesting set of problem domains when we look at the consumption of a FedRAMP approved resource, and then that hybrid environment that's back on-prem, right? And so you have the issues around compliance and authority to operate that is largely an enclave that's in the cloud service provider itself. But if you want to bridge that gap where you move data into those cloud service providers, do you extend that ITAR domain back into the on-prem data center? Does that potentially violate some of the ATO agreements that are in place with the cloud service provider? And so we need better guidance and better insight as to how do we build these hybrid environments while still leveraging GovCloud and FedRAMP approved services without violating any of the security parameters that have been put in place.
So you would want FedRAMP in effect for on-prem and government-owned data centers? No,
not necessarily. The idea is not to try and FedRAMP an on-premise cloud. The idea is that we need clearer guidelines as to what those boundary controls are and how we can interoperate with those approved services without violating their authority to operate.
Okay, so in other words, you don't want something coming from the government into one of those centers could change the status of it in a way that would be negatively affect cybersecurity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, clearly, if you bridge the gap, when you're building a bridge, right, you've got security constraints on the on-premise system and then the cloud system, and so how do you mate those two together so that you don't open up a security hole, right?
In other words, in a chain of data centers and resources, the least secure, that's the security.
Yeah, right. And in many cases, the policy as it's in place today is that you don't build that bridge, right? Mm-hmm. And so that causes some consumption problems for agencies that think that the hybrid solution is their best bet, and so now they have to go back, and there's a longer process to try and understand can you characterize all of those control points and how are they affected if you bring a resource that's not part of that ATO domain.
Got it. So to the extent that it applies to those external resources, though, FedRAMP has enabled hybrid.
Oh, absolutely.
That far.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, Matt, anything to add on that from your perspective?
And I would absolutely agree, because it would be financially infeasible for every agency to do their own analysis of each cloud service provider. It would also be a undue financial burden on the cloud service provider themselves to have to respond to the data calls and work through every agency's ATO process. And I would also like to add that this is one of those cases where the concept of the contractor-owned, contractor-operated cloud inside a federally owned data center further complicates things of does this fall within the domain of FedRAMP, or does this fall within the domain of the agency's ATO process for internal on-prem offerings, and where do you draw those boundaries?
All right, well, I guess that's one you have to take case by case, basically.
Yeah, it's a cloudy issue.
Cloudy issue, yes, it is, clouding right inside here. Yeah, with a chance of rain. I want to move on to, from that one, to some of the development issues we were talking about earlier. And Richard, you've got a sandbox created in the cloud for new development of applications.
That's
Tell us how
correct.
that works and
Well-
what the advantages are of having that in the cloud.
Well, the cloud, again, it's the perfect environment. If someone says, I have an idea, something I want to test out, pre-cloud, but we'd have to, give them dedicated on-prem resources, and with the cloud, we're setting up one both with Microsoft and with Amazon, where our developers will have access to this sandbox to be able to test out an hypothesis and try something out before we decide whether we're going to go forward with that development.
So you don't have to buy every department its own PDP-8. They can have a cloud.
Right. And you can set it up. They can do their test, and you can tear it down, and you pay for what you ate. It's a great consumption model.
And have any applications so developed actually made their way into operation for you yet?
We're in the middle. We have several they're cooking right now. So.
All right, good. Yeah, Kirk, so the elasticity for developmental projects, what's a good model for agencies to approach that such that maybe those development groups can they use their own credit card if the budget authority is there and not have to go through channels, for example, to get that set up?
Yeah, certainly that's an option, right? The sandbox option, I think, is an interesting concept. Within NetApp, we've done our own series of cloud initiatives where we've moved some of our internal software development and some of our analysis of the actual performance of our controllers out to clouds. And we've institutionalized it as part of our IT process, right? So a user wishing to consume cloud services actually moves into this sandbox environment. And so these are cases where we may or may not have access to those profiling tools I had mentioned. And so we let them onboard that application into this environment where we have the ability to look at the security constructs that are leveraged, the performance constructs that are actually being consumed. And from there, we can use that as an assignment of that particular application into either a cloud or a performance category within that cloud. And so, users may come in and say, yeah, I need, the highest performance that's available to me. And, once we profile it and actually put it into that sandbox, we say, no, you're not high performance, you're low to medium. And so that is the resource that we'll schedule you for. Ultimately, by understanding that and institutionalizing that as a process within our IT framework, it now gives us the ability to be a better service delivery provider to our customers, in this case, our actual developers, and then ultimately to be a better service consumer whenever we go to the cloud.
So that is to say applications are born cloud almost in that way.
Yeah, that's a good way to birth applications, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think Kirk just mentioned was, or maybe in your question about, somebody running out with a credit card and being able to do it. One of the reasons we've set up the sandbox is we're trying to not have it that we have, with all of our operating administrations, that we have all these different cloud instances going on. That's one of the reasons we've created this departmental sandbox, is we're trying to direct all of that traffic to that so that we can have some idea of what's going on, some control.
Okay, so it's not everybody picking their own cloud and charging.
Yes.
What is your business model for that so that you have some prediction or predictability of what the cost will be to operate that?
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And they know it, so that when they come, we have this idea, we can give them some idea of what the cost of that, their portion of the sandbox would be.
So you kind of have a total overall budget for what you think it'll be for the year,
Right.
and then it's a chargeback type
Right.
of system to those.
I just when you said, run off with a credit card, I thought that's one of the things under my FITARA responsibilities. I'm trying to have some control and idea of how we do our IT spend, and we don't want it done, here, there, and everywhere.
Because if they develop something on the dark web, it'll get back to you anyway as the CIO.
Well, I guess so. Yeah.
Hopefully that
We call
won't
it
happen.
shadow IT.
Shadow IT. All right, good. So Matt, how do services come into that whole equation?
Well, in many cases, another advantage of this type of architecture is by providing that sandbox for the developers to do their work, you give them the advantages of them just going out to a cloud provider themselves as far as not having to contact IT, being able to use cloud automation tools to stand up development environments, to test things, but it gives you some level of control as well so that it's not the total wild, wild west, and you know that the environment that they're developing and testing in more closely resembles your production environment, lowers your risk, increases the chances of those applications actually performing in a predictable way once you push them to production. So that's one of the great advantages of doing this, and if you can get to where you can provide those services rapidly enough, it discourages some of the shadow IT propagation that we've seen that has been one of the issues with cloud computing adoption.
Also gives you an opportunity to standardize on development tools that are being used, so that you don't end up building 100 apps in 100 different ways. We can standardize on the tools and the data sets and all that.
Okay, good. And the other thing that goes with cloud, and especially hybrid cloud, that it becomes an issue is virtualization. And those two areas of technology, cloud and virtualization, have really been hand in hand, I think, for the federal government. And so as we have virtualized applications, OS, and memory into virtual machines, that creates a need for compatibility in some kind of I/O situation, and also, all of the parameters of an application between the on-prem and the cloud. But it's getting more complicated, or is it getting less complicated as more elements are virtualized, that is to say, databases and networks? Good question, but I think...
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a question there, but I'll give you my insight from a technology perspective. So, yeah, you're right. We've gotten to the point where we understand virtualized applications and virtual machines quite well. As we move down the stack in the networks, well, now you have the era of software-defined networking, which is really, network virtualization. So you no longer have static elements. You have the ability to dynamically provision these resources.
So even IP addresses move along with it.
Yeah, connect endpoints and basically build these fabrics of routerless topologies. And then as you move further down into the stack, the storage is undergoing the same set of transformations, where we virtualize storage now, and you're not necessarily running against a specific storage controller or a set of disks. You now have some virtualized resource pool of capacity and performance that you can dynamically scale up and scale back as applications require. And so the technology, I think, is maturing. The real issue that our customers face, either for the on-premise folks or even in the cloud and in hybrid aspects, is that control plane, right? What is the control plane that allows you to rapidly provision a virtual, a network, and a storage resource so that they can come together and be leveraged, in real time? And so there's some interesting technology fights that are happening out there. Is this going to be controlled purely through an open source environment, or are there vendor-specific implementations where that integration is already provided to you? And then there's probably some hybrid environments in terms of how this gets brought together and ultimately delivered. So we're still in its infancy stages, but I think virtualizing all aspects of the stack is ultimately where we'll head. And once we get that accomplished, this hybrid environment becomes extremely interesting from a consumption perspective.
Richard, safe to say that's something you're looking down the road at, the virtualization next phase, as you look at the cloud next phase.
Yeah, I think he said it perfectly, is that we're looking at the virtualization of the entire stack, network, storage, compute, the whole 9 yards.
All right, a final question I wanted to ask is about SLAs, because that's what governs the relationship that you have with hybrid environment, with the external piece of it. And how do you balance SLAs with cloud providers in a hybrid environment versus what you are expecting for performance from the native data center that's within the agency? Matt, any good ways to approach that?
So again, the first place to really start with this is looking at what are your business requirements. So it's real easy to just throw investment at business continuity and disaster recovery, but you really need to start with what is your business processes that you're trying to protect, and what is the mission impact. So I think if you start there, that's going to organically define what are your SLAs, what are your your RTOs and your RPOs for the IT assets that support a business process. So I think that's really the way to look at it. And obviously, if you have a hybrid scenario, your lowest SLA is going to be your net SLA, and that has to be considered in the cost and the investment strategy.
All right, Richard, final word on how you're looking at SLAs and what you're looking for. Is it safe to say your future is hybrid?
I think it's safe to say all our futures are hybrid. I think that there's no way around the fact that as much as I love cloud, the thought of someday that everything I do would be done in the cloud, not going to happen. We're always going to have stuff we're doing on premise, and how we manage those two worlds, blend those two worlds together is the key.
All right. On that note, we will end the discussion. Great job. I want to thank today's guest, Richard McKinney, Chief Information Officer at the Transportation Department, Kirk Kern, the Chief Technology Officer at NetApp U.S. Public Sector, and Matt Livingston, Cloud Computing Architect for SAIC. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM. For much more on this discussion, to revisit federalnewsradio.com.
On behalf of NetApp and SAIC, thank you for joining our discussion. We will have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate will receive an email with download instructions immediately following the webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.